Hey guys, this is Dave with AudioIn, and this is the Golden Ages 1979 TWS from Moondrop. Of course, my current favorite budget TWS set is the Space Travel, which is also made by Moondrop. I also have the Little White and the Evo, but they've got a lot more than that. That's just what I have on hand right now. So Moondrop has been pretty busy on the Bluetooth / TWS front lately, and for the most part, I think they've been putting out some pretty solid products. But what about the Golden Ages 1979? Is it any good? Well, those are the questions I'm hoping to answer in this review. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. In the box, we have the TWS earphones themselves. It also comes with a charging case and then a protective cover for the charging case. They also include a small assortment of ear tips and a Type A to Type C cable. It's priced at $79 and it uses a single 13mm planar driver. It has a stem style design, which I know some people don't really care for. Doesn't really bother me, and as far as the design itself, I think it's actually kind of cool, I guess. I do like the orange color scheme, and I also think the cassette tape graphic on the front of the case is pretty cool. My only complaint is that the build quality of the earphones themselves isn't great. It does feel a little plasticky, I guess, for lack of a better term. That being said, it is light and it's also pretty comfortable. And again, I do like the color scheme and the overall general design. Now, as far as specifications, features, and functionality, this does use the latest Bluetooth 5.3, so it's going to keep a very solid connection. You're not going to have to worry about latency with gaming. It actually does have a gaming mode, and it's also going to support some of the higher quality Bluetooth codecs like LDAC, although I did have some issues with that, but I'll save that for the sound segment of the review. And then of course it all supports the more common codecs like AAC and SBC. As far as noise canceling, I did try it. It does work okay. It's definitely not the best I've tried because I can still hear some outside noise kind of bleeding through, but it does help a little. And then I also tested all of the touch features, and those worked almost perfectly. It was very responsive to my touch, and I had no issues with it not recognizing the tap pattern. So in terms of function, everything worked almost perfectly, and it worked as it should. Now, another cool feature of the Golden Ages is that it is compatible with Moondrop's Link 2.0 app. And if you are familiar with that, you'll know it gives you access to a few more features, including some EQ presets, touch controls, firmware updates. Then you can also access the ANC functions in the app as well. And then finally, I did some battery tests as well. It claims about 6 hours of playback time, which actually isn't that great. And I was actually getting more like 5 to 5.5 hours, and that was with noise canceling off. Now, it does say that if you're using the LDAC codec, that can actually cause increased battery drain, and I did use the LDAC codec almost the entire time, so that could have been part of the reason I wasn't getting that full 6 hours of claimed playback time. So just something you might want to keep in mind. And then the case will give you 3 full charges, so ideally you should be getting about 18 hours total playback time, but again, for me it was more like I think total 14 to 16 hours. Okay, let's move on to the sound. So before we jump into the sound, I quickly want to touch on the issue I was having with the LDAC codec. With the first two firmware versions, LDAC was working great for the most part, and that was using my S23 Ultra and also Moondrop's new phone/DAP, the Miad 01. And then I updated the firmware to 1.1.0, and all of a sudden I no longer had LDAC support. Long story short though, all I had to do was update the Moondrop Link 2.0 app to the latest version, and then it added a new tab in the settings within the app itself, and then that allowed me to toggle LDAC off and on again within the app. So just bear in mind that if you update the Golden Ages firmware, then you also need to update the app as well to the latest version, and then you should be good to go. Okay, now let's jump into the sound. So along with the LDAC control in the updated app, Moondrop also added two new EQ presets. So originally you had reference, monitor, and bass head, and then with the update, they've added one called 5128 target and then another called secret. But with the original three presets, so reference, monitor, and bass head, all three have a pretty neutral signature, with most of the focus being on the upper mids and treble, and then they are a little light on the mid bass. As a matter of fact, with the monitor and bass head profiles, there is a substantial dip in the lower mids that causes it to sound very thin. So instruments that should have a fuller bodied sound, or male vocals that should sound rich and husky, they just simply don't. Now, the reference profile does have more mid bass presence, so much of that richness and body does get restored, but it still wasn't quite to the levels that I preferred. That being said, of the three original profiles, reference was my favorite, and it seemed to be closest to my personal preferences. Now, another issue I had with all three of the original profiles was that they all lacked bass, even the bass head profile. Because while it did have somewhat of a bass boost compared with the other two profiles, because of the lower mids being kind of sucked out, so to speak, it still really didn't have enough bass presence in my opinion. And they also lacked in treble extension. But again, the bottom line was that none of the three signatures really were very close to my target preference, which is, again, neutral with a bass boost. So then came the update, and with it, the addition of two new EQ profiles, the first being again the 5128 target and the second being secret. So now you have a total of 5 profiles, and with both of the new ones came that added mid bass and also bass that was missing in the previous 3 profiles, especially with that 5128 target profile. It adds a nice amount of sub bass. So now with both of these new profiles, I finally got that mid bass back, which was great. However, then I noticed something going on in the mid range. They just didn't strike me as sounding how I would typically expect it to sound with a neutral signature. Not that it sounded bad necessarily, it just sounded different. And I did like both of the newer profiles, but there was still something, again, about the upper mids that did have it bordering on sounding maybe a little unnatural. And in the end, I did still prefer the tuning of the space travel over any of the Golden Ages available profiles. Now, another thing I should point out is that I did actually just end up going back to the original reference profile because of the 5, that was the only one I kind of liked. So that was the profile I ended up doing most of my listening, my personal listening, but also my testing with. But I quickly want to back up just a little bit and talk about some of the other characteristics that I typically look for when I'm testing an IEM. And I'll try to move through this quickly because this did have lots of good qualities in its base with the newer profiles, and even in the reference profile. It had good dynamics, so kick drums were impactful. They had nice amounts of slam. In both the 5128 target and reference profile, there was also good bass extension, so you had some of that bass rumble, that sub bass rumble, helping to support the rest of the bass frequencies. And there was even good separation with bass and mid, so coming out of the bass into the lower mids. So I didn't really hear that much bass bleed, and for the most part, the mid sounded really clean. And then as you move into the treble, I did notice that it seemed to be lacking as far as treble extension. And while I could appreciate that smoother presentation, it just didn't quite give me as much air and shimmer as I would have liked. And while I did feel like it rendered cymbals and hi-hats smoothly and naturally, and also even brought good energy to cymbal strikes, I did feel like it was lacking a little bit in terms of treble detail and that micro detail, which is honestly kind of to be expected in this price range. And then in regards to its technical performance, it was okay. I guess the soundstage had about average width for an IEM, but its forward presentation was a little more on the intimate side, so it didn't give me much in terms of forward depth. And while it also didn't give me a lot in terms of instrument layering, it did do a fairly good job with the left to right instrument positional cues or the instrument placement. So I guess the big questions are, is the Golden Ages a good value, and would I recommend it? Well, the answer to the first question is I'm not sure. I do think that the recent updates do fix some of the issues, but at the end of the day, I just preferred the $25 space travel over the Golden Ages. Now, as to whether or not it gets my recommendation, again, for me personally, even after all of the added EQ profiles, I still wasn't really able to find anything that I liked better than the stock profile or signature of the space travel. And that might be different for you, and hopefully my explanation of the different sound profiles was enough to maybe help you make that decision. And I know there has been some positive feedback in the community, and there's no doubt there are those out there that will love it. Again, especially for those who like a more forward mid-range or vocal presentation, because it does do that pretty well. So that concludes my review of the Moondrop Golden Ages 1979. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video. I hope you guys have an awesome day.